In this lesson, we'll create a rendering. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to navigate to the render workspace and create a rendering. In Fusion 360, we're going to start with the design Utility Knife Render. We're going to move from the design workspace to the render workspace. Inside of the render workspace, we have a handful of controls that we see inside of our toolbar. We can control the setup of our scene and appearances. We can create an in-canvas render, which creates a local ray-traced image, and then we can produce a render either locally or on the cloud. Our gallery is going to be displayed at the bottom where we would typically see our timeline. The render gallery will save all of our images and turntable animations in the cloud, and we can also download them locally if needed. On the left-hand side, our browser displays all of our components and bodies in the design. And we also still have our comments at the bottom. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the basics of rendering inside of Fusion 360. To get started, we first are going to navigate to the Appearances section. When we select Appearances or you hit A on your keyboard, you'll be displayed with an appearance dialog. We have options to apply appearances directly to bodies or components, as well as individual faces. We'll have an In This Design section, which will show us all of the appearances that are in this current design. And then in the bottom, we have a library. The library contains various types of appearances. In some cases, for example, if we go into Paint and we select Metal Flake, you'll notice on the right-hand side we see an icon. This icon means that this appearance is available but not yet downloaded. If you want to use any of these appearances, you simply need to click the download icon, and while it's downloading, it'll show you a small icon in the upper right-hand corner, and then it'll be available. You can see also that the background of that appearance is white, while the others are sort of a light gray. There's also a My Appearances section, which you can create and customize appearances and save them on the cloud. And there's also a Favorites section. When you have appearances that you use often, saving them to a favorite section can be extremely helpful. If we right-click, notice that we have Add to Favorites. The first step to applying an appearance is first finding one that you like. In this case, I'm going to go to Glossy Paint, and I'm going to select a red glossy paint. It's listed as Paint Enamel Glossy. This can be dragged and dropped in this design over a current appearance, for example, the yellow, or we can also drag and drop it onto a body or component on the screen, or onto one that's inside of our browser. Note that when you have an appearance applied to multiple bodies or components, simply overwriting it directly inside of the In This Design section can be a helpful option. You can also right-click on these and make adjustments. For example, if we edit, we can modify the color of this. We can drag it back down to a yellow color. We can also select Advanced and take a look at some more advanced properties for this material. In this case, notice that we have translucency, emissivity, we have a relief pattern or a bump, which in this case doesn't apply, cutout, and advanced highlight controls. You can really get in and customize these appearances to your liking. In our case, I'm going to go back to that red glossy enamel, drag it over there, and select Close. Now that we've made some adjustments to the appearance, let's take a look at the scene settings. In scene settings, we have two tabs, Settings and the Environment Library. In the Environment Library, again, we'll see instances where we have an option to download. For example, if we want to use the Skylight option, we can select Download. In order to use this current environment, we can drag it up and into our current environment, or we can drag it into the canvas area, and this will replace our current environment with whichever one we have selected. In the settings, we'll see that we have the option to change the background to an environment or a solid color. Whenever we select an environment, it will be used for lighting effects. However, the background will only be displayed if we use it as an environment. We can also change the position. In this case, by rotating around, we can change the location of the lights. You can see them being adjusted on the reflection of the blade in this case. We can also reset it back to the default. Further down, we have the option to turn on or off a ground plane. We can determine whether or not we want to flatten the ground, and this will be more apparent when we're dealing with a scene that really has some background imagery, and we can also turn on or off reflections. Further down, we have camera settings. By default, it's perspective with orthofaces just like it is in our design workspace, but we can leave it on pure perspective if needed. We can adjust the focal length of the camera. We can also modify things like the exposure value, whether or not we're using depth of field, and what the blur aspect is when we're using depth of field. Also, we can set the aspect ratio. For example, if we're going to be creating a 16:9 export, we might want to use that option. Now that we have a good understanding of both the appearances and our scene settings, the next option here is decal. Now there's already a decal applied to this. In this case, you can see the Autodesk decal. If we select decal, we'll be able to navigate through our data panel or on your local machine to find a specific image. Certain images will work better. Generally, I like to use a PNG with transparent background, as that'll display best over most of the designs. We're not going to be applying a decal in this instance. I just want to note that the decal has been applied using this method. Next, we have texture map control. Texture map control is more apparent whenever we have an appearance that has a texture, such as a carbon fiber or a wood grain. This gives us the option to determine how that texture is applied. Automatic is going to be the default setting, but depending on the shape and the design, you can select one of the other options. We can also modify things using a UV diagnostic. For example, we can take a look at the layout of the diagnostic grid. In this case, you can see that it's going up and down based on the geometry, and we can make adjustments to that. In our case, we don't have an appearance that has any real texture to it, so we're not going to see a drastic difference. The next section is something called in-canvas render. In-canvas render, or ray tracing, is a way for us to produce a rendered image directly in our screen. Ray tracing is going to use your computer's processing power. And what that means is as soon as you start this process, the CPU is going to begin to churn on making a rendered image. The ray tracing is exactly what happens when we're producing a local or a cloud render. However, this just happens in real time on your screen. Ray tracing basically boils down to calculating the way light is going to bounce around each pixel in the design. So the higher quality, the larger the image, the more reflective the materials are, the longer this process will take. You also note in the bottom that we have an arrow slider which we can set to excellent, final, or even all the way up to infinite to just simply let it process as long as we want. Once we're happy with the result, we can pause the processing and we can capture that image and save it locally. It is important to note that with ray tracing, as soon as you move the screen or move the design, it's going to restart that process. So you may want to go into the ray trace settings and modify it to lock the view. This will prevent you from moving it around while ray tracing is happening. Lastly, we can take a look at the render options. We have several different predefined sizes that we can use, or we can go to a custom size and determine what the size of our image is going to be. For example, we're using 1920 by 1080 as a 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio. We can determine whether or not this is done on the cloud or locally, and what we want the render quality to be. Keep in mind that anytime you're using a cloud render, you will be required to use cloud credits. If you need more information about cloud credits, I suggest you check out the help file to learn more about cloud credits and how you can acquire them. For us, however, we're not going to actually produce any additional renders after this first one. So if you want to create a render and you want to save cloud credits, you can use a smaller size, which will use less cloud credits, or you can select the local render option, which will be done on your local machine. Keep in mind that you do have to set the standard or final quality, and there's also an advanced setting, which allows you to set it all the way up to excellent. So again, I'm going to use Cloud Render, one cloud credit for 800 by 600 pixels, and allow this to render. It's going to save the document, and it's going to show the render completing in the bottom section in our render gallery. Once the render has finished completely, it will allow you to see it here and also download it to your local machine. Once our render is complete, let's go ahead and left click on it to select it. This will display it a little bit larger, and from here we can do some quick post-processing. We can download it, we can delete it, and we can even re-render it as a turntable. The turntable animation must be done on the cloud, and this is only available after you create an initial render. It'll take the default size that you set, and you can determine whether or not you want 6 or 36 frames, and whether or not you want the quality to be standard or final. Once you create this render, you will be able to see a 360-degree rotation animation of the design. This can be downloaded as a few different file types. It can be an HTML document, an animation, or even an exe file. So if you want to create a turntable animation, make sure that you first create your render, and then go ahead and create a turntable animation after that. Once you have more than one render of the same exact file and scene, you'll be able to expand it in the gallery and you can see which one is the turntable. If we select turntable, you'll see a rotation of the design on the screen. In our case, since I chose 6 frames and a fairly low quality, you can see that it's jerking or jumping around between each frame. You can set it to 36 frames to have a little bit higher resolution, but those are the only 2 options that we have currently for a turntable animation. Once you're done, you shouldn't have to save your file, but if you do make any additional changes, do make sure that you save your file before moving on to the next step.